They circled the pier like footsteps that never touched wood, and when I first heard them, I thought the sound was my own heart echoing in the dark. My name is Tomas, though I stopped answering to it the night I started going down to the water. The town calls the place the Old Reach, a crooked pier, a handful of salt-bleached posts, and a lake that eats the light. I moved back for a while, wanting the quiet my grandmother promised was stored in the air here. Quiet, it turns out, is only a surface. Beneath it, there are currents you can't see and voices that sound like wind because your brain reaches for explanations it can hold. The first night, it felt like the fog was listening. I remember the smell first, not the sharp, clean tang of sea salt, but something softer, rotten at the edges like old pages left in damp. It clung to the collar of my coat, to my teeth, and the dampness made the hair at the back of my neck stand up. I was standing at the end of the pier, where the boards groaned if you shifted your weight too fast. The town's lamps were out. There are half a dozen people left in winter, and the moon had learned to hide. That's when I saw them. Pale shapes farther out, just under the surface, like faces pressed to fogged glass. For a heartbeat, I thought they were driftwood with white rags caught on them. Then one turned its head. Their eyes, God, their eyes, were pinpricks of light, like someone had pushed a match into the darkness and left it burning. Not reflection. Not reflection, because they did not blink. The light was steady, patient, as if watching me catalog its edges. My mouth went dry. The air itself seemed to climb into my lungs more slowly, as if the lake had started pulling at breath. I should have walked back. I did not. I told myself that I would only watch, that once I understood what they were, I could make sense of it. You tell yourself 100 small lies before the kind that keeps you alive. Around my ankles, the water moved without leaving a sound. The first time I heard a voice, and it was a voice, not a song, low and wrong in the throat. I thought it was coming from inside my head. The syllables were like salt on the tongue, a name I knew, but stretched and unfamiliar. It called me differently every time, soft as if it had been rehearsing how to enter a room. Behind me, the pier creaked. Someone else had come out to the end. I turned, and for a moment, the shadow there was mine and not mine, because my silhouette was joined by another that faced the water. I had the ridiculous, sudden certainty that if I spoke, if I laughed or shouted or ran, they would answer. So I did what cowards do. I waited to see whether fear would decide for me. They began to learn the parts of me they could use. After that first night, sleep stopped being a shelter and became a map. I started counting the hours between the moments when the house felt empty and when the pier began to breathe again. The town offered explanations: algae blooms, pranksters, old men with too much whiskey, small, comfortable lies. They suggested I stop going down there. They did not know how the water remembered names. The second week, the voices stopped being vague. They took on the cadence of people I loved and people I had wronged. A woman hummed a hymn my grandmother used to sing. The tune warped as if played on a broken gramophone. A child laughed my name from under the boards. Each sound left a taste, metal and wet paper, on my tongue. Once, while washing my hands, I thought I felt fingers press the back of my wrist from beneath the sink. When I looked up, I watched my reflection blink late, and the mirror surface of my own eyes was suddenly too bright. I told myself it was exhaustion. I began to keep my coat on inside the house. They were patient because they had time. The lake could wait. I found evidence that people had been closer before. A baby's shoe on the shore, half buried, its laces knotted like a secret. A photograph softened by water where a man's face had been smudged away. There were footprints on the pier sometimes, single sets, worn and small, that led to the end and then stopped as if the wood itself had swallowed them. Once I followed one set and felt the boards under my feet go warm, then return to ice. Then the mimicry began. I answered the voice that called me one late night because I was hungry for proof that I was still me. It said my name in my sister's voice, the one I hadn't heard since she left town. I called back. For a moment I could have sworn a shape surfaced and smiled. It was only the moonlight finding an indent in the water. But the next morning, my sister's neighbor knocked and told me she'd found a message carved into the back of their mirror. My handwriting, uneven and wobbly. I had never written it. Fear turned to watchfulness. I tried to catch them in the act, approached the edge with a lantern and a camera. The photos came back blank where their faces had been, then burned like a film left too long in the sun. Sound recordings were contaminated. When I sped them up, they became speech. When I slowed them down, they were songs I used to hum as a child. The most honest recording caught nothing but a long, patient silence, and at the end of that silence, unmistakable, was my own voice whispering, "Come closer." The nights grew thicker. The hair on my arms stood straight, as if tiny hands were tugging at the fibers. Once I felt something small and smooth brush the skin at my ankle, a cheek, perhaps, or a mouth, and then the water sucked at my boot like a curious animal. I stepped back and the thing recoiled, leaving a ring of cold that traveled up my calf. When I looked down, there were small crescent marks in the wet wood, like nails or teeth. I started losing things: keys, a wallet, the photographs of my grandmother. Each item reappeared later, placed carefully at the end of the pier, as if offered. The last time I picked up a photograph, it was still warm. The eyes in it had been scratched out with a fingernail. Above the pier, the shadow that had stood behind me on that first night grew sharper, no longer my silhouette, but an outline that waited, patient as the tide. The night I stopped pretending I could walk away, the water smelled like metal and old wood. It was colder than I remembered, like the breath of a basement opening beneath the sky. I walked the pier with my pockets empty and my palms raw from not sleeping. The town was a smear behind me, lamps pinpricks swallowed by the fog. At the end, the shadow waited where it had always waited, an outline that was almost me and almost not, as if the pier had given up trying to hold a single shape and was keeping them all at once. I brought a lantern that night, more out of habit than hope. The circle of light trembled against the water, and the faces leaned in like moths. Their eyes were the same, steady pinpricks that did not blink. Their mouths were thin, as if sewn, but sometimes they opened in the wrong rhythm, and I could hear words that made my knees go soft. I told myself that I was going to demand answers, that I would take back the names they had stolen. I told myself 1,000 small braveries until the pier did the thing it does best. It showed me a mirror I could not refuse. Under the lantern, the water turned oily and black. When I leaned close enough to see my reflection, there were two reflections, one that trembled with the lantern and another behind it that smiled before I had time to choose an expression. I recoiled. The other hand at my shoulder was not mine. It guided me to the edge with a gravity that felt like memory. I felt its fingers, cool and patient, find the hollow between my ribs and press, as if testing whether my heart would take the direction it preferred. They had learned patience. They had learned the shape of longing. The voices began to speak in languages my bones recognized. Lullabies in my grandmother's cadence, the scrape of my father's boots, the way my sister used to say my name on the phone. Each sound was a small theft. Each return thing was slightly altered, as if the lake stitched it back together with water and intent. I saw my life offered to me, artifacts placed in neat piles on the pier. The photograph with the scratched eyes, my childhood sweater curled like a sleeping animal, a coin I had dropped on purpose months ago. They wanted me to take them. I wanted to take them. So I stepped into the water. It did not grip me, it accepted me. There was no violent pull, only an evening out, a leveling like sliding into a pool after a long fever. The cold went past my knees, my waist, my chest, until my lungs were the last thing resisting the law of the lake. Beneath the surface, I did not drown. I listened. There were rooms under the water, full of curtains and low lamps, faces arranged like family portraits. They had mouths full of other people's names and hands full of promises. One of them brushed my face and did not feel like a hand at all. It felt like the idea of a hand. Then a voice, my voice, said something soft and patient in a language I had used only when alone. When I climbed back onto the pier, I was wearing someone else's hesitation. The lantern cast two shadows, one that belonged to me and one that belonged to the thing I had become by learning how to answer. Behind me, on the shoreline, a figure approached, young, stubborn, carrying a coat like mine. I could see the tremor in their jaw when they reached the edge. I could feel the tilt of their curiosity as if it had weight. I opened my mouth because they had taught me to open it. The sound that came out was mine stretched thin, like a reflection pulled across water. It sounded like home. The thing behind me moved its head toward the water and did not turn. I think the lake keeps what it wants. Now I call them home.
subscribe to Horror Story Bar.